Welcome to Revenge Justice, where every wrong finds its payback. Several years ago, I lived inside a life that, when I finally stepped out of it, I could hardly believe I'd ever agreed to. Not because it was glamorous, far from it, because it was ordinary in the worst possible way, quiet cruelty disguised as normal, little things that chip away at you until one day you look up and the person you married no longer resembles the man you promised forever with. We split in 2018, and even saying that feels like an understatement. He wasn't just difficult, he was a whole other category: narcissistic, controlling, manipulative, physically violent at times, emotionally and financially abusive, the kind of person who makes you doubt the reality of your own days. My sister used to joke, badly, that I was going to be a case file on some true crime podcast. That was how bad it was. But this isn't a story about the worst nights. It's about the small betrayals that built a house of debt around me and the precise, quiet way things came undone. It's about a car lease, an Excel spreadsheet, a co-signer, and later, a man who thought everything was disposable, especially me. When we married, he needed a vehicle, badly. He was undeniably reckless with money. He had a track record, jobs that didn't stick, bills that piled, a pattern of spending like tomorrow owed him something. Between his sloppiness and my attempts to keep us afloat, we ended up with a debt hangover, his mess and mine tangled together. At one point, I was carrying an extra $10,000 in debt because of decisions he made. He was carrying $50,000. He wanted a new car. He couldn't get approved for an auto loan because of his financial past, so he leased. But he needed a co-signer. We were married. I had good credit. It was simple. To him. And it was presented like a natural ask. One of those "we're a team" moments, framed to look like support. He convinced me to place the lease in my name, and somehow, he convinced me to let the payments come from my bank account. I signed the dotted line, took the responsibility, trusted him, foolishly. That's the cruel trick of it. Abuse comes wrapped in trust until one day that trust becomes a chain. Months later, I was T-boned. Someone hit the driver's side of my car. The vehicle was written off. The insurance payout was my temporary lifeline. I started car shopping, cautious, begrudging, expecting to replace what I'd lost and move on. He suggested, almost casually, that I use my payout to buy him a manual transmission BMW. A car triple the value of my payout, one I couldn't drive, one he wanted, and apparently one he expected me to fund. This was the first time I stood up and felt myself fully stand. I said no, and I said it slow, I said it clear, I said it like I meant it, because I did. I wasn't buying a car I couldn't drive so he could be flashy. I wasn't footing the bill for the life he chose to lead. He called me selfish. He gave me the silent treatment, a few days of icy silence before normalcy resumed, except things didn't go back. That refusal lit something in me, something like daylight through a slit in a door. I started packing small things, not big gestures, nothing dramatic. Little pieces of my life moved out in careful increments so he wouldn't notice until I was too ready to stay. When I told him I wanted a divorce, I did it the practical way. I made an Excel spreadsheet. Numbers are a kind of truth that can't be argued with, and I wanted clarity. I listed every cent he owed me, the back payments on his leased vehicle, the halves of the bills he'd skipped, half the rent when he'd disappeared on paydays. I detailed everything. I was methodical. I promised to cover half the house until the end of summer, 60 days notice, and after that, he could do as he pleased. I told him he was responsible to move the car payments to his own account, to secure a new co-signer, and to remove my name from the lease. Words on a spreadsheet, neat, precise, carrying the weight of everything I'd endured. He moved on quickly, like some people do, finding someone else before the ink was dry on the papers we'd both signed. Within a week, a new girlfriend, pictures, videos, all over social media. Love bombing, slow dances in living rooms, silly captions, a relentless display of normalcy. He told his friends we'd been separated for weeks. When people asked me, I told them the truth. We'd only just split. I'd just moved out. It felt strange to be the one honest about the timeline. He posted photos where she reclined behind that leased wheel, the car that still listed my name. Payments were still being pulled from my accounts for months after the divorce. He posted videos of them driving, of a bright laugh, and a woman who apparently had no idea the car under her had my name stitched into its legal DNA. I snapped. Not in a grand way, not with bombs or public spectacle. I did what felt right, which in the moment was small and delicious and perfectly petty. I changed the Netflix password. I canceled the internet service. Little domestic annoyances, sure, but in the context of everything else, they felt like small victories. I sent him a message. If he wanted to pay, raid his new girlfriend around our house and in our car, and keep using nets and streaming accounts we still paid for, then he had 24 hours to remove me from the lease. Maybe his new girlfriend could be his co-signer. The message was clipped, direct, yes, vindictive, but also necessary. He replied with anger, with that thin, practiced conviction abusers use to make their victims seem irrational. Things take time, he wrote. I'm waiting to hear from the leasing company, and beneath that, the implication, calm down, be reasonable, be patient. Your expectations are selfish. That was the moment the gloves came off. I was done playing the part of the reasonable woman while he continued to enjoy the benefits of my credit and my patience. I called the leasing company. I don't remember exactly what I said, only that the woman on the line became my ally in under 20 minutes. She listened, the kind of listening that doesn't condescend. She told me she'd look into it, and then she told me something quiet and surgical. He had not contacted them to request removal of my name. She walked me through the process that would allow my name to be taken off the lease legally. Paperwork would be sent. He would be notified. Forms to sign would appear in his inbox, and if he didn't act, the standard penalties and notices would start to apply. I thanked her. I texted him. I told him to keep an eye on his email. I told him, gently, and not so gently, to figure his problems out. It felt like the first time I'd spoken with a kind of legal leverage behind me. It felt like dignity. Weeks later, I met his father to hand over some of his things, small, banal tasks that come after a marriage ends. There at the edge of civility, his dad admitted what I already knew quietly. He'd reluctantly agreed to co-sign. He didn't want to, but the son had strong opinions, family pressure had its gravity, and then there was the man who loved his grandson and didn't want the rest of the family to be dragged into the shrapnel, a reluctant co-signer, a man who would hate what that debt could do to his credit. I stored the fact away. It felt like a legal breadcrumb. Honey. Small, but valuable. Fast forward to 2020. The world had tilted. Lockdowns, the small routines that kept life ordered, gone. People adapted. Phones rang more. Lived-in spaces became offices. And in that quiet, the leasing company began calling me. Not often at first, a ring every few weeks, a voice asking for him. Each time, I said the same thing. We were divorced. I was no longer on the lease. I hadn't heard from him. Please stop calling my number. They kept calling. Every 2 weeks, like the tick of a metronome. Not hard to connect the dots. Payments due. Missed. Someone not answering. A debt beginning to breathe loudly again. I asked for confirmation. Formally, that I was no longer on the lease. I wanted a letter. A paper that could be held up like a shield. They sent one. The letter confirmed I'd been removed. It also, curiously, still listed our old address, the house we'd lived in together 2 years prior. He hadn't bothered to update his contact details. A small oversight, a pattern, another piece of information filed for the future. I tried not to let it pull me under. Each call wound me back into those memories, into the way he controlled small things until that became enormous, into the therapist's office where I picked apart how I'd allowed so much. Each ring was a step backward, Nini. So I call at a manager and ask for the calls to stop. to remove my number permanently so I didn't have to gatekeep his chaos out of my life anymore. When the manager called back, his voice was cautious, the sort of tone people use when they're holding a blade and trying not to cut. He asked if I had any way to get in touch with him. I told him the short version. We're divorced. I don't want contact. He's unreliable with money. The manager couldn't confirm anything on their end. He did offer to remove my number. He also asked, almost apologetically, if I might have a more recent address or phone number for him. It was professional. But there was a hunger in the ask. The sort of hunger anyone in collections has. I thought about it for a beat. Then I gave him my ex-father's mailing address and the father's home phone number. The manager took them. He said he could not officially solicit the information, but that it would help if I provided a contact that might reach the borrower. I gave it. I hung up feeling a small jolt of something that could be called satisfaction, because I knew what kind of man his father was. I'd seen him at family dinners, meticulous, quietly proud, careful with his finances. A man who hated anything that could touch his credit rating. He had become, under duress, the cosigner. And a cosigner is a patient weapon. When the borrower defaults, the cosigner is the one who receives the call. The cosigner is the one whose credit is on the line. The cosigner is the one who would understand painfully and immediately what an 8-month default does to a clean financial slate. I pictured a 5'7" man who kept account ledgers in his head. A man who deserves things ordered and intact. I pictured him being told in a voice that is chilling with consequences that his co-signed debt is late. I pictured the ritual of denial, the first calls, the polite confusion, the frantic accounting, the blood pressure rising with every missed payment. I admit it, I allowed the image to unfold. Not because I wanted anyone to suffer in some cruel way, but because a man who had once laughed at my fear needed to feel a ripple of fear himself. Not violence, not cruelty. A ripple. A reckoning. Months passed. The calls to me dwindled. I'd given the manager the contact he wanted. I thought that would be the end of it. It wasn't. The pandemic tightened its grip. Anxiety and distance became the new furniture of life. I received the next call 4 months later, and it pulled me back into that old, terrible orbit. This time it was different. The leasing company was calling not for him, but for me, again. And this time, their voice carried urgency. I asked to speak to a manager who could stop the calls, and when the manager did call, he asked for confirmation. He asked, sensitively, if I had any way to reach my ex. I told the bare facts. I noticed that he was careful with his words, the kind of care people have when they are about to break news. He thanked me for the contact information and confirmed he would stop calling my number. But then, the conversation turned. He mentioned, casually, that the file still contained our old address. He could update the mailing contact if I so wished. I paused. I could have refused. I could have said none of my business. But the truth is, something in me had changed. The woman who answered that telephone line was not the one who had said yes to a lease that bled her credit. She was tired. She was careful. She was done being walked over. So I gave him the father's address again, and the father's phone number. After we hung up, I sat with a strange quiet. The action itself was mundane, a name, a number, a transfer of an address. But the effect was rippling. I had put the problem where it belonged, on the man who had agreed, reluctantly, to be responsible for his son's debts. Not on me, not anymore. Time moved the way time does. Slow, and then suddenly. And then the day came when the manager called back to say his team had begun mailing notices to the co-signer's address. There were official letters. There were late notices. There were the bureaucratic sounds of a debt waking up and stretching. Letters that said what I already knew. Missed payments, demands, collections pipeline. The manager's voice was sympathetic. He wasn't malicious. He was doing his job. I listened, and for the first time in a long time, I let myself breathe. It's easy to make revenge sound like a flame, to imagine fireworks and public humiliation. I don't do fireworks. I do documents. I do phone numbers. I do the slow unspooling of arithmetic until the truth sits, stark and undeniable, on a ledger. There is a justice in that, a quiet balance. In my head, I built the scene again and again. The co-signer reading a letter while his morning coffee cools, the pulse quickening, the disbelief turning into arithmetic, and then the anger. He would call his son. He would ask how many payments he had missed. He would call the bank. He would wrestle with pride and responsibility. He would, perhaps, be furious. He might curse the son who had put him in this situation. He might, in that fury, reach out to the son and demand payment. It's a private humbling, the kind that burns quietly but long. I didn't wish him physical harm. I didn't want the family to implode. I wanted the scales to tip. I wanted accountability. For once. When the calls from the leasing company stopped filtering through my phone, I let out a sound that felt like both laughter and relief. It wasn't triumph so much as closure. It was the knowledge that the chain of calls that had yanked me back into that marriage like a leash was loosening. I had set a small, careful domino in motion and watched it fall. I had done it without spectacle. I had done it without violence. I had done it with the exact tools he'd used against me: inertia and his own poor choices. People ask me often, in therapy or in a quiet message from someone who thinks they might be living the same script, whether I felt guilty, whether I worried I'd become the monster in someone else's story. The answer is complicated. I did not feel guilty for protecting myself. I did not feel guilty for making someone responsible for the consequences of their choices. But I also watched from a distance and kept the human part of myself engaged. If the father was hurt through the son's faults, I felt for the father. I do not celebrate collateral suffering, but I also accepted cause and effect. What changed me, beyond the spreadsheet and the manager's polite voice, was how I learned to own the quiet levers of life. The things that feel small at the time, changing a password, calling a company, sending a letter, these things add up. They are practical actions that build a perimeter. They are the scaffolding of a life rebuilt. It has been years. My life is different now. The debt that once felt like a living creature gnawing at my heels does not define me. I worked with a therapist. I learned to set boundaries and to spot the creeping patterns of manipulation. I rebuilt my credit. I found friends who spoke the truth when I didn't. I found strength in paperwork, in banks, and in emissions, in the little things most people never consider dramatic. The slow work of restoration is the kind of revenge that heals instead of destroys. And sometimes, only sometimes, I allow myself a tiny indulgence, a mental replay of the moment his new photographs showed a woman behind the wheel of the car still under my name. I imagine the moment the father's mail hit the kitchen counter, the thin paper fluttering with a weight heavier than anyone imagined. I imagine the phone call, the sighs, the math scrawled on a napkin. I imagine, too, the son's fury. Not because he'd lost me, not because of the shame, but because the ledger had come due. That is the scene I savor. Not blood, not damage, not cruelty, but the small, perfect justice of consequence. And if someone asks today whether I'd do it again, would I have called that manager and given him that number? The answer is yes, because I wasn't trying to hurt someone for pleasure. I was trying to untangle myself from a man who had treated me as if I existed to finance his life. I was removing the weight from my shoulders and placing it where it belonged. And in doing so, I learned something crucial, that the quiet, lawful turning of the wheels can be far more satisfying than any loud revenge. So if you're listening to this, and you're sitting in a car that doesn't feel like yours, or you're the one paying for someone else's choices, know that there are small, legal, practical steps that can reroute a life. They aren't glamorous, they aren't cinematic, but they are effective. They restore balance, and they let you sleep at night. I won't pretend the scars disappeared overnight. They left marks, emotional and practical, but those marks taught me where I begin and where I end. They taught me how to make a spreadsheet and mean it, how to call a company and keep my voice steady, How to let the machinery of bureaucracy, tedious, dull, patient, deliver its own kind of justice. In the end, it wasn't a scream. It was a form, a signature, a piece of paper that said, "Not my responsibility any longer," and that was enough. Thanks for listening. If this story resonates, subscribe for more faceless, true-to-life tales. Leave a comment below. Tell me what you would have done, or tell me about a quiet victory of your own. And if you're struggling right now, get help. You don't have to navigate it alone.